everyone, today I have my hands on the new GM 50mm f1.4, yes, another GM 50. The first one we had was the f1.2 that was released not that long ago. I'll leave that video link down below if you want to watch. Today we have the f1.4 version. So we'll start just here. I think it would be cool if you're standing in the sun. Oh, look at that big spider web. As always, I'm going to be taking this lens out to do a portrait photo shoot to see how it performs in the real world for both photo and video. I have lots of unedited 100% crops of the photos I'm taking to share with you, so make sure you're watching this video in 4K so you can see all the details. I also brought along my Zeiss 50mm f1.4 to take a few comparison photos with throughout the day, which we'll take a look at later on. The biggest advantage this lens has over the GM 50mm f1.2 in my opinion is the size and weight. This GM 50 f1.4 is slightly bigger than the GM 35mm f1.4. It weighs 516 grams compared to the Zeiss 51.4, which weighs 780 grams, and the GM f1.2 version, which weighs 778 grams. This 50mm features the same 67mm filter thread we see in the G20, GM24, and GM35. We have a focus ring, a focus hold button, and a focus mode switch between AF and MF. There is also an aperture ring, of course, an aperture click switch, and I really like that Sony are now adding an iris lock switch to their lenses more often. We also saw this featured in the G20 to 70mm f4 lens I recently reviewed. This lens is so easy to work with at a portrait photo shoot. It did a great job at keeping up with Olia, who I asked to move around as much as she can throughout the photo shoot because we want to make it a challenge for the lens. I was making the camera and lens do all the work with a wide focus area for autofocus. You can see the IAF was very sticky on the subject throughout the entire shoot. If it's possible with your dress too, you could kind of crouch. Yeah, that's beautiful. I found I had an extremely high in-focus ratio for this portrait session and was really pleased to see some tricky poses where the eyes are quite obscured, still had tack-sharp focusing on the iris. Just like any lens though, this lens also misses focus here and there with a fast-moving subject, so it's not perfect, especially at f1.4, but overall, I'm really happy with the results as I felt like I could rely on the lens. I did a test on a separate day with Dan where I took 3 sets of 20 photos with Dan and the camera in the same spot without moving and captured on average 19 of 20 photos with critical focus on the iris. We also did the same thing again, but this time with Dan walking towards and away from the camera with an average of 17 of 20 photos with critical focus. The majority of the time, focus would slip when Dan is in close range of the camera around shoulder to head length, and we'll be able to take a closer look at this when we have a look at video examples later on. Next, let's take a look at bokeh. Now, a question I have on my mind that I'm sure some of you do as well is it worth it to spend more and carry around the heavier f1.2 version of this lens, or will this f1.4 be enough? I have a few comparison images to share between the f1.2 versus f1.4 GM 50mm lenses. These were not taken on the same day, but I picked very similar looking images to take a look at. I honestly think that unless you're shooting with both lenses side by side, taking the exact same images specifically to compare bokeh, for example, you won't really be able to tell a difference in real world usage. And this is coming from me. I love as much bokeh as I can get. I love dreamy out of focus transition in my images, and I'm also dreaming of a GM 85mm f1.2 and waiting to see if Sony will announce something about that. But in all honesty, I really don't think it makes a huge difference in real world usage. For example, a new 85 will be interesting to see as the original GM 85 55mm f1.4 is getting a little dated now, but the GM50 1.2 was only released 2 years ago, so it's still very new and has that new GM look that all Sony lenses have now. It's sharp, it has great autofocus performance and accuracy, both shoot up to 30 FPS. There's really not a lot of things to let that lens down aside from maybe the size and weight, as I mentioned earlier. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Speaking of the GM50 1.2, this f1.4 version also has a very similar looking lens flare. I really loved the rainbow lens flare from the f1.2, and it looks like the f1.4 also has the same thing going on. I'm not sure if it's because the lighting was a little stronger during the f1.4 photoshoot, but the lens flare placement is higher in the frame, and we have a double rainbow happening, which can get in the way of some compositions, as you can see in this shot here. One of the flares is going right through Olia's face. But in saying that, I think this is a really nice lens flare that can be used creatively in photos when shooting backlit, rather than a lens flare that looks distracting that you need to work around to avoid. Wide open, this lens is extremely sharp, and I would trust using this lens regularly at f1.4 because of that. I think the render of skin looks great as well, and I really enjoy what the sharp to out of focus area looks like. It's a very smooth transition, which I always love to see, especially for portrait photography. At f2.8, we have even more sharpness. I think these photos look so beautiful, and I love the amount of detail and clarity you can see.
So I also want to compare a few shots at wide open 1.4 and also at f5.6 as well. So we'll get a 1.4 shot here. We've got some really nice bokeh in the background. And then I'll bump it up to 5.6 as well.
So let's take a closer look at some of my shots in Lightroom. Here are some areas of my backlit photos where you would normally be able to see chromatic aberration, such as the light in Olia's hair here, as well as when the light hits her white dress. And as you can see, the majority of these images are clean. I did have a handful of photos with CA, some were more prominent, and some photos had minor purple fringing. Before we move on to video, I have those Zeiss 50mm f1.4 comparisons that I've been taking throughout this photo shoot to show you.
Oh, that looks nice with like a little bit of hair going in front of your face too.
A couple of technical things I noticed about the Zeiss compared to the GM is the Zeiss has oval looking bokeh towards the edges of the frame. I personally don't have a preference between the Zeiss oval bokeh or the GM eye-shaped bokeh. The Zeiss also has some chromatic aberration. You can see a bit of purple and green fringing in these photos. To be fair, it's not much CA, but it is enough that it would add an extra step for me in editing to get rid of it. Looking at these images side by side, I think both lenses are about the same in terms of sharpness and overall image quality. Let me know what you think. Dan captured these video portraits of Olia with the A7S III and the GM 50mm f1.4 wide open, making use of a wide focus area to make the lens and camera do all the work to be able to see autofocus performance. I think this lens looks really beautiful for video. There is a lot of clarity in the footage, and I love how the subject stands out from the background. But taking a closer look at this footage, I do believe there are a few things that make this lens stronger for photography rather than being a lens that's also great for video. One of the first things that catches my eye is the focus breathing. Here are a couple of tests I did at some different apertures and distances. As you can see, this GM50 1.4 has significant focus breathing. Something else I noticed is the autofocus of this lens is not as sticky as I'm used to seeing with GM glass. Ouch. Just a reminder, I am using a pre-production copy of this lens. At first, when we started filming these shots, I thought it was maybe Olia's hair getting in the way of focusing, but there are frames where Olia's eyes are clear in the shot, and as Dan moves towards or away from her, you can see focus slipping here and there from her eyes. It would be great if focus could be stickier on the subject. Since this lens is so sharp, when it slips, it's really obvious and breaks the immersion of the video. Aside from that, I also like the colors straight out of camera too. These are all filmed in S-Log and converted with my custom LUT. Here I have more tests that Dan and I did on a different day to see video performance on the A7 IV this time instead. I think this lens does a great job at keeping focus on a subject further away from the lens. When capturing mid-length and full-body video shots, this lens has no problems keeping focus on the subject even while they're moving around. I do find the focus slipping mostly happens when capturing close-distance video shots. When I bring my hand up to the camera to see how fast it will catch focus, you can see it struggling with movement and it feels like the autofocus is unpredictable. When I take my hand away, it's fast to find focus, but if I move, it slips straight away. This was not reflected while taking photos. I had a very high in-focus ratio for my portrait photo shoot, even during the mid-length and close-up portraits. And as you could see, Olia was moving around a lot and super fast while we were taking photos. So it's interesting to see the difference with video autofocus performance. When I take my hand away and stay still, it does a great job at finding focus and sticking with it too. Overall, I think this GM 50mm f1.4 is a fantastic option for photography. It's great to see another good quality 50mm available with great sharpness and autofocus performance. Next in the 50 range, I would personally love to see a budget-friendly G50mm f1.8 for example.
That is all I have for today's review on the GM 50 1.4. Let me know what you think of this lens and of the review and the photo shoot down in the comments below because I love hearing from you all. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I make new videos every single week, so I will see you all next time. Bye.